In 1990, a movie taught the whole world to love the mob. Goodfellas made it look like the best life a person could ever have. Money, loyalty, friends who felt like family. What most people never learned is that almost all of it was true. And the parts the movie left out are far darker than anything it put on the screen. Here is the thing nobody tells you. The famous robbery in that film really happened, and afterward the men who pulled it off were hunted down and silenced, one by one, on the orders of their own boss. That is not the dark exception. That is the pattern. Across all 5 New York families, the deadliest danger was almost never the rival across the street. It was the friend across the table. This is the real story of the 5 families, the one proven in courtrooms and uncovered years later. It is darker than the movie, and every word of it is true. Section 1. The movie that taught the world about the mob, and the real robbery behind it. In 1990, a movie came out that changed how millions of people pictured the American mob. It was called Goodfellas. A director named Martin Scorsese made it, and people still call it one of the greatest crime movies ever filmed. If you have any picture in your head of what a New York gangster looks like, how he talks, how he eats, how he treats the men around him and the people he hurts, there is a strong chance that picture came from this one film, even if you have never sat down and watched it. The story follows a man named Henry Hill. He grows up in New York, and from the time he is a young boy, he wants one thing more than anything else. He wants to be a gangster. He looks out his window at the men across the street, the ones in the sharp suits with the nice cars and the thick rolls of cash, and he decides that is the life for him. The men down the block are treated like kings in their own neighborhood. Nobody bothers them. Everybody knows their names. To a kid with nothing, that looks like the whole world. So he starts running small jobs for them when he is still a child, and over the years he climbs his way deeper and deeper into their world. More than anything, the movie shows you how good that life can feel from the inside. There is money everywhere. The men eat in the finest restaurants and never wait for a table. They walk into clubs through the back door, and a table appears for them at the front, while everyone else stands in line. They steal things, they sell what they steal, and they spend the cash almost as fast as it comes in. They have each other too. They eat together, they laugh together, they raise their kids on the same streets. For long stretches of the film, being a gangster looks like the best job a person could ever have. Then, the cracks show, friends turn on each other. People get hurt over small things, over money, over a word said the wrong way. Toward the end, the fun drains out and fear takes its place. And the man who wanted this life so badly ends up scared, hunted, and alone. By the time the movie finishes, the dream has fallen apart. Henry Hill was a real person. He was not made up for the screen. He lived in New York. He truly did most of the things the movie shows. And the film was built on a book about his actual life. A writer named Nicholas Pileggi spent a long time sitting with Hill, listening to him talk, writing down everything he could remember. That book came out in 1985 and was called Wise Guy. The movie followed a few years later. Almost every face in it stands in for a real man who really walked around New York, breathing the same air as everyone else. The tough older gangster, played by Robert De Niro, the one the younger men look up to, was based on a real man named James Burke. People who knew him called him Jimmy the Gent. The short, frightening one played by Joe Pesci, the one who can be joking one second and deadly the next, was based on a real man named Thomas DeSimone. The calm, heavy boss, who sits back and lets the younger men do the work, the one they all answer to, was based on a real man named Paul Vario. These were not invented for a story. They were people with homes, with families, with long lists of arrests behind their names, and they all belonged to the same group. In New York, the mob worked as 5 separate groups, and each one controlled its own slice of the city. People called them the 5 families. Their names were Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and Paul Vario all worked under the Lucchese family. So the movie that taught the whole world what the mob was really only showed one small corner of one family out of 5. These 5 families were not small clubs. They ran for most of the last century. They had hundreds of members and many more men working under them who were not full members. They made their money in a few main ways. They lent money to people who could not get it from a bank, then charged so much to pay it back that the person could never get free of the debt. They forced shop owners and business owners to hand over money just to be left alone. They stole truckloads of goods and sold them. They took control of whole industries. Places like the docks where ships unloaded, the building sites where new towers went up, and the companies that hauled away the trash. If you lived in New York during those years, some part of your daily life touched one of these 5 families whether you knew it or not. The movie gets a great deal right. The big robbery at the heart of it truly happened. The killings in it truly happened. The man it is based on really did turn against his closest friends in the end and spend the rest of his days hiding under a different name, looking over his shoulder. The government really did take him and his family and give them new lives in new places, so the mob could not find them. None of that was dreamed up by a screenwriter. A movie, though, has to fit inside a couple of hours. It has to choose what to show and what to skip. It has to soften the worst parts so that an audience can sit in a theater and eat popcorn and still feel something other than sick. And when you go back and read what actually happened, not only to Henry Hill but to all 5 families, you find a story that runs much darker than the one that played on the screen. None of this is gossip or wild rumor. Most of what you are about to hear came out in real courtrooms, said by men under oath, written down by judges, juries, and government lawyers. Members who had spent their whole lives inside the families finally sat down and told the truth. Bodies that had been hidden for years were dug up out of the ground. Trials were held, and the men in them were found guilty and sent away. The record is real, it is public, and a person can go read it today. That record is worse than the film. Think about what the movie chose to make you feel. It wanted you to enjoy these men. It wanted you to like the jokes, the food, the loyalty, the thrill of getting away with things. That choice was not an accident. It is how Henry Hill himself remembered the early years, back when the life still felt like a gift and the price had not yet come due. The film follows his memory, and his memory begins with joy. The full story does not begin and end with one man's good memories. It includes the people on the other side of the violence. It includes the men who were lured to friendly meetings and never came home. It includes the strangers who happened to be standing in the wrong place and caught a bullet meant for someone else. It includes the families who waited for a husband or a son who had already been killed and buried somewhere they would never think to look. The movie did not have room for all of them, this does. So the plan from here is simple. We are going to walk through all 5 families, one at a time, and look at 2 true cases from each. 10 cases in all. Every one of them is backed by court records, by sworn testimony, or by reporting from the time it happened. Some of these cases are the very ones the movies are built on, only told without the music and the warm glow. Some of them are stories the movies never had the nerve to tell at all. And by the time we reach the last one, the gap between what people think they know about the mob and what really went on should feel impossible to ignore. Henry Hill's whole world, the one the movie made famous, was held together by money. There was never enough of it, and the men around him were always chasing the next big score. For years, they got by on small jobs. A stolen truck here, a robbed delivery there. Enough to keep the cash flowing, but never enough to feel safe. Then, near the end of the 1970s, they pulled off the one job that was supposed to set them up for life. It was the largest cash robbery the country had ever seen up to that point. For about a week, it made them rich. What that robbery did to the men who pulled it off in the months that followed is where the real story starts to turn, and it is the part the movie could only show you a sliver of. On the night of December 11, 1978, a small group of men pulled off the biggest cash robbery the United States had ever seen up to that point. It happened at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, at a building owned by a German airline called Lufthansa. When the night was over, the men walked away with about $5 million in cash and another $800,000 or so in jewelry. In the money of today, that would be worth far more. No shots were fired. Nobody at the airport was killed. The whole thing took a little over an hour, and then the men were gone. This is the robbery at the center of Goodfellas. The movie shows it. It shows the men planning it, pulling it off, and then falling apart afterward. So when you watch that film and see the big score that was supposed to fix everyone's life, you are watching a real event that truly happened, told in a softer and shorter way than how it really went. Here is how it came together. The whole thing started because of a debt. A man who worked at the airport for the Lufthansa airline owed money to a bookmaker, which is a person who takes illegal bets. This airport worker knew something useful. He knew that about once a month, large amounts of cash were flown into the airport from Germany. That cash often sat in a locked room at the airport overnight before anyone came to move it to a bank the next day. The worker passed this tip to the bookmaker he owed money to, as a way of saying there was a fortune sitting almost unguarded if the right people wanted to take it. The bookmaker passed the tip along to a man he knew named Henry Hill. Yes, the same Henry Hill the movie is about. Hill brought it to the man he looked up to most, James Burke, the one the movie calls Jimmy the Gent. Burke worked under the Lucchese family, one of the 5 families of the New York mob. Because of his Irish background, Burke could never become a full member of an Italian crime family, so he always stayed an associate, a man who worked closely with the family, without ever being one of them on paper. Still, he was trusted, he was feared, and he had a crew of men who would do what he told them. Burke went to his boss in the Lucchese family, a man named Paul Vario, to get the okay. In that world, you did not simply pull off a job this size on your own. You needed permission from above, and you owed a cut of the money upward when it was done. Vario gave the go-ahead. He had recently lost a large sum on a drug deal that went bad, so a giant pile of untraceable cash sounded very good to him. Burke picked his men. He chose a crew to actually go into the airport and grab the money, and he gave smaller jobs to others. One man's only job was to get rid of the van they used to make the getaway. Burke even brought in his own son to help drive. The plan was careful. They had inside information about where to park, what time to go in, how long they had, and how the locked room worked. On the night itself, the masked men got into the airport building, rounded up the workers there, kept them under control without killing anyone, and loaded up the cash and jewelry. They drove the loot to a meeting spot, moved it from the van into the trunks of regular cars, and split off into the night. On paper, it was almost perfect. They had taken more money in one robbery than anyone in the country had ever managed before. For a few days, every man involved was rich beyond what he had ever imagined. Then it started to go wrong, and the reason it went wrong is almost too simple to believe. One man had been given a single, easy job. His name was Parnell Edwards, and people called him Stacks. His only task was to take the van they had used and drive it to a place where it would be crushed and destroyed, so that no evidence inside it could ever be traced back to the crew. That was it. Get rid of the van. Instead, Stacks drove the van to his girlfriend's apartment, went inside, and did not destroy it. He left it parked on the street near a fire hydrant. 2 days later, the police found the van right where he had left it. Inside it were fingerprints and other clues. That one mistake gave the police their first real thread to pull, and it connected the crew to the robbery. In the movie, this moment lands like a punch, because everyone watching understands what it means. The job was supposed to be clean. Now it was not clean. And in that world, a loose end like this did not get a warning or a second chance. The robbery itself was a giant success in terms of money. The trouble was everything that came after it. The men who had pulled it off had millions of dollars in cash that could not be traced. That should have been the dream. But cash like that is dangerous in its own way. If a man who was nearly broke last month suddenly buys a brand new car and a fur coat for his wife, people notice. The police notice. And in this case, the boss of the operation gave a clear order. Do not go out and spend big. Do not draw attention. Keep your head down and stay quiet until the heat dies down. Some of the men listened, some did not. And that split, between the ones who stayed calm and the ones who could not help themselves, is where the story turns from a clever robbery into something much darker. The movie shows part of this. It shows the tension after the job. It shows the boss getting angry when his men start showing off their new money. It shows the warm feeling between these men starting to curdle into fear. What the movie can only hint at, because it has to keep moving and keep an audience in their seats, is just how far that fear went and how many people it swallowed. It is worth stopping to understand who these men were as a group, because it tells you why the aftermath went the way it did. They were not careful businessmen. They were not part of some quiet, orderly operation. They were a crew of robbers and hijackers who had spent years stealing trucks coming out of that same airport. They were used to taking what they wanted by force. They were used to solving their problems through violence, and they had done it many times before. When a problem appeared, their first answer was rarely to talk it out. It was to make the problem disappear. So when the van mistake put the police on their trail, the man in charge faced a choice. Every person who had touched the robbery, who had helped plan it or carry it out, was now a person who could talk. If the police squeezed any one of them hard enough, that person might give up the others to save himself. To a careful man, that is a list of risks. To this crew, with this history, that list of names started to look like a list of problems that could be solved the way they always solved problems. There is one more thing about this robbery that makes it matter so much. For years afterward, the police were certain they knew who had organized the whole thing. They were sure it was James Burke. They were sure he had planned it and pulled the strings, but they could never prove it in court well enough to charge him for the robbery itself. The reason they could not prove it is the dark heart of this whole story. The witnesses who could have pointed at Burke kept ending up dead. The more people who could talk were silenced, the less evidence remained, and the safer Burke became. In the end, only one man was ever found guilty in connection with the actual robbery, and that was the airport worker who had given the original tip. Think about what that means. The largest cash robbery in the country's history, a crime that millions of people now know about because of a famous movie, and almost nobody was ever punished for it in a courtroom. Not because the police were lazy or stupid. The opposite. They knew. They just could not make the case, because the people who could have helped them were buried before they got the chance. The money, by the way, was almost never found. The cash and the jewelry seemed to vanish into thin air. Decades later, people were still searching, still digging, still wondering where it all went. Most of it has never been recovered to this day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the robbery in Goodfellas was real. The men were real. The boss who gave the order was real. And the mistake with the van was real. And the warning not to spend the money was real. The movie got the bones of it right. What the movie gives you in glances and quick scenes, though, is only the start of what actually happened to the people who pulled off that job. Because over the months that followed that one perfect night, the men who had touched that money began to die, one after another, in ways that even a movie like Goodfellas could only show you a small piece of. Section 2. Lucchese family, the bodies after the robbery, and the two detectives who killed for the mob. The robbery had gone perfectly. The men were rich. And then, over the next several months, the people who had touched that money started to die. The first to go was the man who made the careless mistake with the van. His name was Parnell Edwards, the one they called Stacks. His job had been to destroy the getaway van, and he had failed to do it, and that failure had handed the police their first clue. Just 7 days after the robbery, On December 18, 1978, he was shot and killed inside an apartment. He was the very first loose end to be tied off, and his death set the pattern for everything that followed. The man in charge had decided that anyone who could connect him to the robbery was a danger that needed to be removed. It is important to be careful and honest here about what can be proven and what cannot. The man the police believed organized the robbery, James Burke, was never charged in court for the robbery itself, and he was never charged for most of these killings. So when these deaths are described, they are described the way the record describes them. They are killings that were widely believed to have been ordered by Burke, based mostly on what Henry Hill told the writer of the book the movie came from, and on what investigators pieced together over the years. The deaths themselves are real and documented. The exact hand behind each one is, in some cases, a strong belief rather than a proven fact. That distinction matters, and it should be kept in mind through this whole section. With that said, the trail of bodies after the robbery is long, and it is grim. There was a bookmaker named Martin Krugman. He was the man who had first passed the airport tip up the chain. He had earned a cut of the money for his part, and he wanted it. He kept asking for it. He kept pushing and complaining that he was owed. In that world, a man who talks too loudly and demands too much becomes a worry, because a worried, angry man is a man who might one day go to the police to get back at the people who cheated him. About a month after the robbery, Krugman disappeared. He was never seen again. His body was never found. People close to the crew said he had been killed, and that his remains were gotten rid of so completely that nothing was ever recovered. His wife was left with no husband and no answers, only a husband who left one day and never came back. There was the short, frightening man the movie is partly built around, Thomas DeSimone. In the film, he is the wild, joking, dangerous one, played by Joe Pesci, the one you are never quite sure about, the one who can be laughing one second and deadly the next. DeSimone was real, and he was every bit as violent as that. He was one of the men who had killed Stax Edwards. But DeSimone himself ended up eliminated in January 1979, a little over a month after the big robbery. His death, though, was not really about the robbery. It was about other killings he had done. He had eliminated 2 members of a different crime family without getting permission first, and in that world, killing made men from another family without a green light was a death sentence of its own. So the man who helped silence the first loose end was himself silenced, for reasons that reached back before the robbery ever happened. His body was never found either. There was a couple, a man named Luis Cafora and his wife. Cafora had helped with the robbery. Afterward, the order had gone out clearly. Do not spend big. Do not show off. Cafora ignored it. He bought his wife a bright pink car, the kind of flashy purchase that draws every eye on the street. That kind of attention was exactly what the boss feared. Both Cafora and his wife vanished. Their bodies were never found. The detail that lingers is that his wife had nothing to do with the planning of the robbery. She was simply married to a man who could not keep his head down. There was a woman who was killed, and whose body, unlike so many others, did turn up, in a way that is hard to forget. Her remains were found in pieces, part of her washed up on a shore. She had been connected to some of the men in the crew, and was believed to have had knowledge of where the stolen money was being hidden and moved. That knowledge made her dangerous, so she was killed and cut apart, and the sea gave back only a piece of her. There was a man whose frozen body was found inside a refrigerated truck, the kind used to keep meat cold. He had been tied up and left there. Children were the ones who found him. He was believed to have been skimming money, taking some of the stolen cash for himself through businesses that were supposed to be quietly washing it clean. Taking from the crew's money was, by their rules, a reason to die. The list goes on. People who had helped plan the job, people who had carried it out, people who had only stood near the edges of it, kept turning up dead, or simply stopped existing. By the time it was over, the number of people connected to this one robbery who had been killed or had vanished reached at least a dozen. Some were shot in the head, some were strangled, some were taken apart. Many were never found at all, their families left forever without a grave to visit or a body to bury. This is the part of the story the movie could only show you a sliver of. Goodfellas shows some of these deaths. It shows bodies being found. It shows the fear spreading through the crew as they realize that being part of the big score now means being a target. But a movie has to keep moving. It cannot stop and sit with every single person who died. It cannot show you the wife who waited for a husband who was already gone, or the parent who never learned what happened to their child. The real story has more victims than the film has room for, and many of them were people whose only crime was knowing too much or standing too close. Step back and think about the logic of it, because the logic is the most disturbing part. The robbery was supposed to be the perfect crime. It nearly was. The plan worked. The money was taken. The only thing that went wrong was a parked van, and the answer to that one mistake was not to run, or to hide the money better, or to lie low and hope. The answer was to start killing the people who had helped, one by one, until there were so few witnesses left that the police could never build a case. The killing was not rage. It was not done in the heat of an argument. It was cold and planned. Each death made the man at the top a little safer. Each silenced mouth meant one less person who could ever point a finger. And it worked. That is the thing that should sit heavily with anyone who hears it. The strategy of murdering the witnesses actually succeeded. James Burke was never convicted for the robbery. He was never convicted for most of these murders. The reason he walked free of those charges is the same reason so many people died. The evidence had been buried, sometimes literally, in the ground or in the sea. Years later, Burke was finally sent to prison, but for other crimes. He was convicted in connection with a scheme to fix the outcomes of college basketball games, and separately for a single murder of a man unrelated to the basketball case. He died behind bars in 1996, of cancer, never having answered in a courtroom for the robbery that made him famous, or for the trail of bodies it left behind. The man whose life the whole movie is based on, Henry Hill, saw all of this happening around him. He watched the people he knew disappear, and he came to understand something simple and terrifying. He was a person who had touched the robbery too. He knew things. By the cold logic that was killing everyone else, he was a loose end as well. The fear that he might be next is a large part of what eventually pushed him to do the thing that gangsters were never supposed to do. He went to the government, and he told them everything, and he became a witness against the very men he had spent his whole life trying to join. His testimony helped put away dozens of people. In exchange, the government gave him and his family new names and new lives in new places, far away, where the mob could not easily find them. So the bright, fun world from the start of the movie, the one with the money and the laughter and the loyalty, ended like this, with friends killing friends. With a dozen or more people dead or vanished. With a wife in a pink car who is never seen again. With a man frozen in a meat truck found by children. With the perfect crime turning into a months-long hunt in which the hunters and the hunted were the same men who had celebrated together just weeks before. This is one robbery, one crew, one small corner of one of the 5 families. The Lucchese family was only one of 5, and what happened after the airport job was the kind of thing that happened, in different shapes, across all of them. The pattern repeated. Money or power created a threat. The threat created a target. And the target was removed, often by the very people who had once called him a friend. The men in this story used violence to protect themselves, and they used it well enough to escape the law. But there is a darker chapter still inside this same family, one where the people doing the killing were not only gangsters, some of them carried badges. Some of them were supposed to be the ones protecting the city from exactly this kind of bloodshed, and what they did with those badges is one of the worst betrayals in the entire history of the New York mob. There were 2 men in New York who spent their days carrying police badges and their nights working for the mob. They were detectives, real ones. They had spent years on the police force. They had solved cases, and they were respected by the people they worked beside. And the whole time, they were also taking money from a gangster to help him get rid of people. This is one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of the New York mob, and unlike so much of this story, almost all of it was proven in a courtroom and is a matter of public record. Their names were Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. People came to call them the Mafia Cops. They worked for the New York City Police Department. Ippolito was the more outgoing of the two, a big, loud man who wanted attention. Caracappa was the quiet one who stayed in the background. What made Caracappa so dangerous is that he had helped create and run the part of the police department that investigated mob murders. That meant he had access to some of the most secret information the police had. He knew which gangsters the police were watching. He knew who was secretly working with the police as an informer. He knew the inside details of investigations that were supposed to be hidden from the very criminals they were aimed at. The gangster they worked for was a Lucchese family underboss named Anthony Casso. People called him Gaspipe. The underboss is the second in command of a family, the man right below the boss. Casso was, by any measure, one of the most violent men in the entire New York underworld. He admitted to taking part in dozens of murders over his life, and for a stretch of years, he had 2 police detectives on his payroll, feeding him secrets and even doing killings for him. The way it worked was simple and chilling. The 2 detectives were paid a regular monthly amount, a kind of salary, just to keep the information flowing. When the police were closing in on someone, the detectives could warn the mob. When someone secretly agreed to help the police bring down the mob, the detectives could find out and pass the name along, which usually meant a death sentence for that person. Casso later described the 2 detectives as something like his crystal ball, because through them he could see things he was never supposed to see. The flow of secrets ran in the wrong direction, out of the police department and straight into the hands of a killer. But these 2 men did more than just hand over secrets. They took part in the killing themselves, and the details of how they did it are hard to stomach, precisely because they used the trust people had in police officers as a weapon. A jury found that the 2 detectives took part in, or helped with, 8 murders. They were also found responsible for 2 attempted murders and a plot to get rid of another person. These were not vague accusations. They were laid out in a federal court, backed by witnesses and records, and the jury believed them. One of the worst cases involved a man named James Hydell. The detectives wanted him for Casso, so they used the one thing no ordinary person on the street would ever question. They used their badges. They took Hydell, the way police officers take a suspect, and then, instead of bringing him to a police station, they handed him over to the gangster. Casso then questioned Hydell to find out who else had been involved in an attempt on Casso's own life, and after he had gotten what he wanted, he killed him. Think about how that works. A person sees 2 police detectives. He has no reason to run, no reason to fight. Police are supposed to be safe. Police are supposed to be the people you can trust when you are in danger, and those 2 men used that exact trust to deliver him into the hands of someone who would torture and murder him. There is another case that may be the saddest of all, because the person who died had nothing to do with any of it. Casso wanted a man named Nicholas Guido killed. Guido was a gangster who had been involved in an attempt on Casso's life. The detectives, with their access to records, were supposed to find the right Nicholas Guido and pass along the information so he could be hunted down. But there was a terrible mistake. The information led to the wrong man. There was another Nicholas Guido, a completely innocent person who happened to share the same name. This innocent Nicholas Guido was killed. He was shot outside his mother's home, just after the family had finished Christmas dinner. A young man with the wrong name, in the wrong place, paying with his life for a mix-up in a killer's information. His family lost him during what should have been one of the happiest times of the year, and he had done nothing at all to bring it on himself. The detectives were also tied to the killing of a member of another family during what looked like an ordinary traffic stop. Picture it, A car gets pulled over. Most people, when they see flashing lights behind them, slow down and pull to the side, because that is what you are supposed to do, and because the person stopping you is the law. But when the person in the uniform is secretly working for the mob, that simple, ordinary act of trust becomes the setup for murder. The thing that made these two so dangerous is the same thing that made them so hard to suspect. Nobody runs from a police officer. Nobody expects the danger to be wearing a badge. For a long time, these two got away with it. They both eventually retired from the police force, with their good reputations more or less intact. They moved across the country and settled in Las Vegas, even living near each other. To the outside world, they were two former detectives enjoying a quiet retirement. The truth of what they had done stayed buried for years. What finally broke the case open was a witness. There was a man named Burton Kaplan who had acted as the go-between, the person who carried the messages and the money between the gangster Casso and the two detectives. The two cops did not deal with the mob directly very often. They worked through this middleman. For years, Kaplan kept his mouth shut, because keeping quiet was the rule he lived by. But eventually, he decided to talk. He sat in court and described over several days how the whole arrangement had worked, linking the two detectives to the killings. His testimony was the backbone of the case. It is worth being honest about one piece of this, because it matters for getting the story right. The gangster Casso himself was, for a time, going to be a witness too. But Casso was such a known liar, a man who had changed his story so many times that the people building the case decided he came with too much baggage to put on the stand. So the case did not rest on the word of the killer. It rested on the middleman, Kaplan, and on records, timelines, and other evidence that backed up what he said. That is part of why the convictions held. The proof went beyond the word of any single untrustworthy person. In 2005, the two former detectives were arrested in Las Vegas. In 2006, a jury found them guilty, and in 2009, they were sentenced. The punishments were enormous. One of them received a sentence of life in prison plus an additional 100 years. The other received life plus 80 years. The judge and the lawyers who handled the case did not hold back in describing what these men had done. The crimes were called one of the bloodiest, most violent betrayals of the police badge the city had ever seen. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Betrayal of the badge. When a gangster kills, it is a horror, but it is at least the horror you expect from a gangster. When the people who are supposed to stop the killing are themselves doing the killing, it breaks something deeper. Every person who is murdered by a corrupt police officer is murdered twice over, in a way. Once in the literal sense, and once in the sense that the very system meant to protect them was turned into the thing that destroyed them. The families of the victims could not even go to the police for help, because the police were part of the problem. There is one small, strange detail that ties this whole dark chapter back to where this story began. One of the two detectives, Luis Ippolito, had a tiny acting role in the movie Goodfellas. He appeared on screen, briefly, in the very film that made the world fall in love with the mob. A man who would later be revealed as a real killer for the real mob played a small part in the movie about the mob. It is the kind of detail that would feel too neat if someone made it up. But it is true, and it sits there like a quiet warning about how thin the line really was between the story on the screen and the blood in the streets. So this is the Lucchese family. A famous robbery that ended in a string of murders, and two police detectives who turned their badges into tools for a killer. Both stories show the same thing from different angles. They show how the violence of this world reached far beyond the gangsters themselves and swallowed bookmakers, wives, strangers, and innocent men who simply shared a name with the wrong person. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next family ran things in a very different way. Where the Lucchese story is full of mistakes and panic and loose ends, the next family was known for a certain cold cleanliness in how it disposed of its problems. They had a place, a quiet bar in Brooklyn that looked like any other neighborhood spot. And behind that ordinary front, in a back room, they had built something that turned murder into a kind of routine. Section 3. Gambino Family. The bar with a killing room in the back. In a Brooklyn neighborhood, there was a bar called the Gemini Lounge. From the outside, it looked like any other neighborhood spot. People came in for a drink. Locals knew the place. There was nothing about the front of it that would make a passerby stop and stare. But behind that ordinary bar, in a back area connected to it, a crew of men had set up something that turned murder into a kind of assembly line. Over a number of years, that quiet bar became one of the deadliest spots in the entire history of the American mob. The crew was run by a man named Roy DeMeo, and they worked for the Gambino family, one of the 5 families of New York. DeMeo had grown up in Brooklyn and had once trained as a butcher. That skill, the ability to cut apart a body with cold knowledge of where everything was, became the horrible center of what his crew did. He started out doing small jobs and lending money, and over time he built his own group of men around him. That group became known as the DeMeo Crew, and it earned a reputation for being one of the most violent in New York. What set the DeMeo Crew apart was not only that they killed people. Lots of mob crews killed people. What set them apart was the system they built for making the bodies disappear so completely that the police could not even prove a murder had happened. No body meant no clear crime. If there was no victim to find, it was far harder for anyone to build a case. The crew turned that grim idea into a routine, and the routine had a name. People came to call it the Gemini method, after the bar where it was done. The way it worked was methodical, and describing it plainly is enough to understand how cold it was. A victim would be brought to the back area connected to the lounge, often lured there without any idea of what was waiting. The person would be killed quickly with a gun. Then, to keep the blood under control, the body would be handled in a careful, practiced way and taken apart. The pieces would be wrapped up, packed, and scattered far and wide, dropped in different places across the city so that nothing could ever be put back together or traced. A person would walk into that back room alive and would, in a sense, simply cease to exist. No grave, no body, nothing for a family to bury or even to be certain about. Here it is important to be careful and honest about the numbers, because this is a place where the legend has grown larger than what can actually be proven. For years, the DeMeo Crew has been described as responsible for a huge number of killings, with estimates running as high as around 200. That number gets repeated often, but an estimate is not a proven count. The honest, court-backed figure is much smaller and much more certain. When the case against the crew was finally brought, the evidence presented in court covered 25 murders. So the truthful way to hold this is to say the crew is believed to have killed a great many people, perhaps a very large number, but that 25 killings were the ones actually documented in court. Saying it that way keeps the story solid. Anyone who claims the exact total knows it for a fact is reaching past what the evidence allows. Even at 25 proven killings, the crew stands as one of the most prolific murder operations the American mob ever produced. And the way those killings were carried out, the calm, butcher shop precision of it, is what makes the Gemini Lounge such a dark place in this whole history. The victims came from many directions. Some were other criminals who had crossed the crew or fallen into debt. Some were people who knew too much and might talk. Some were killed over drug deals that had gone wrong. The crew was deep into stealing cars, lending money at crushing rates, dealing drugs, and other rackets. And any of those businesses could produce a person who needed, in their minds, to be gotten rid of. The bar in the back was where many of those problems were brought to be solved for good. One detail shows just how cold the logic of this crew could be, even toward its own members. There was a man who had been part of the crew for a long time, one of the earliest members. He had set up a drug deal involving men connected to a dangerous outside group, and then he had killed those men, which threatened to start a war that could have brought serious trouble down on the whole Gambino family. To keep the peace and protect his own standing, DeMeo had this long-time member of his own crew killed. A man who had been at his side for years was lured in and disposed of like any other problem, because his death was more useful to DeMeo than his life. That is the kind of place the Gemini Lounge was. Loyalty bought a person nothing once they became a risk. The crew did not exist on its own. It sat inside the larger Gambino family, working under a higher-ranking member, and answering, in the end, to the boss of the family. For a long stretch, the boss above all of this was a man named Paul Castellano. And the relationship between the boss and this murderous crew is part of what eventually doomed Roy DeMeo himself. By the early 1980s, the law was closing in. Investigators had begun to notice something that should have been noticed long before. A striking number of people who had last been seen near the Gemini Lounge, or who were connected to DeMeo, had simply vanished. People do not usually disappear in such numbers without someone asking why. A member of the crew was arrested and began cooperating with investigators, telling them things that could blow the whole operation open. Once that happened, the danger was no longer only that the crew might be caught. The danger was that they might be caught and that one of them, to save himself, might point upward toward the bosses. That possibility changed everything. As long as DeMeo and his crew were quietly making problems disappear, they were useful. But the moment they became a threat to the people above them, the same cold logic they had used on so many others turned back onto DeMeo. The leaders of the family grew afraid that DeMeo, with everything he knew, had become too dangerous to keep alive. A man who had spent years killing to protect the family was now seen as a risk to it. In January 1983, Roy DeMeo was killed. His body was found in the trunk of his own car, abandoned in a parking lot. He had been shot. The man who had built a machine for making bodies disappear ended up as a body himself, discarded in much the same casual way. The exact hands behind his death were never fully nailed down in the same clean way a courtroom likes, but the order is understood to have come from the top of his own family, from the same world he had served so violently. The disappearer was disappeared. The butcher was butchered, in a sense, by the very people he had killed for. There is something worth pausing on in this whole chapter, because it goes to the heart of the difference between the movie version of the mob and the real one. The movie often gives violence a kind of meaning. There is usually a reason, an insult, a betrayal, a moment of hot anger that the audience can follow and almost understand. The Gemini Lounge had none of that warmth or drama. The killing there was quiet, organized, and businesslike. People were processed, not avenged. The horror of it is not loud. It is calm. It is the calm of men who had done this so many times that it had stopped meaning anything to them at all. A back room, a routine, a set of practiced steps, and then nothing left to find. No popular film has ever truly shown what that back room was. It is too cold, too grim, too far from the fun and the loyalty and the laughter that make a mob story enjoyable to watch. The Gemini Lounge does not fit into the world of charming gangsters eating big dinners. It is the part of the real story that has no music behind it, no clever lines, no glamour. It is just the plain, terrible fact of what some of these men were willing to do, over and over, in an ordinary neighborhood bar, until even their own boss decided it had gone too far. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Gambino family did not stay quiet for long, though. The cold, careful violence of the Gemini Lounge belonged to one era. What came next for the Gambinos was the opposite of quiet. It was loud, public, and brazen, carried out on a busy street in the heart of the city, during the holiday shopping season, in front of crowds of people. The boss who had sat above the DeMeo crew, Paul Castellano, would himself be killed in the most famous mob hit of all, and the man who ordered it would do it right out in the open, where the whole world could see. Section 4. Gambino Family. The murder outside the steakhouse. On the evening of December 16, 1985, the boss of the Gambino family was shot dead on a busy Manhattan street in front of hundreds of people during the busiest shopping season of the year. It happened outside a restaurant called Sparks Steakhouse in the middle of the city, in the early evening when the sidewalks were full. This was the most famous mob murder in American history, and the man who ordered it did it out in the open on purpose, in a way that broke the oldest rules of his own world. The boss who died was Paul Castellano, the same Paul Castellano who had sat at the top of the family during the years of the Gemini Lounge. By the mid-1980s, Castellano had become an unpopular leader among many of the men beneath him. He saw himself more as a businessman than a street gangster. He lived in a large house on Staten Island, kept his distance from his men, and seemed out of touch with the people doing the dirty work down below. Resentment had been building for a long time. The man who wanted him gone was a Gambino captain named John Gotti. Gotti was ambitious, hungry, and unlike the quiet bosses before him, he liked attention. He wore sharp suits and enjoyed being seen. He believed Castellano was a weak and greedy leader, and he had personal reasons to fear that Castellano might soon move against him and break up his crew. So Gotti decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to get rid of the boss of the entire family. There is a part of this story that explains the timing, and it connects to a man named Agnello Della Croce. Della Croce was a high-ranking, deeply respected figure in the family, and he was a kind of mentor to Gotti. As long as Della Croce was alive, he acted as a buffer that kept the peace and held Gotti's ambitions in check. On December 2, 1985, Della Croce died of cancer. His death removed the one man who might have stopped what came next. Then came an insult that pushed things over the edge. When Della Croce died, Castellano did not attend the wake. In that world, skipping the wake of such an important and respected man was seen as a deep sign of disrespect. It offended many in the family, especially those loyal to Della Croce, and Gotti was among the most offended. On top of that, Castellano passed over Gotti and other senior men and named his own bodyguard, a man named Thomas Bilotti, as his new second-in-command. To Gotti, these moves were both an insult and a warning sign that his own position was in danger. The decision to act was made. The plan was set for a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse. A team of gunmen was arranged. The men were dressed in matching outfits, in trench coats and fur hats, so they would look like a group and be harder to tell apart later. They positioned themselves near the entrance of the restaurant and waited. Gotti himself, along with a trusted ally named Sammy Gravano, parked nearby in a car to watch. As Castellano's car pulled up, the two of them sat and observed the whole thing unfold across the street. When Castellano arrived and stepped out of the passenger side of the car, the gunman moved in. He was shot multiple times right there on the sidewalk. His new second-in-command, Bilotti, got out of the driver's side, and he was shot from behind and killed as well. The two bodies lay on the street, while crowds of holiday shoppers were nearby. After it was done, Gotti drove slowly past the scene to make sure both men were dead, and then left. The whole thing happened so fast and so smoothly that there was little anyone could do. The gunman walked off and vanished into the crowds. Two men were dead on a Manhattan sidewalk in the early evening, and the killers simply disappeared into the holiday rush. What makes this murder so important is not only that a boss was killed. Bosses had been killed before. What made it shocking inside the mob world was how it was done, and the fact that it broke a major rule. There was supposed to be a governing body in the New York mob, a kind of ruling council made up of the leaders of the families, that had to give approval before something as enormous as the killing of a boss could happen. Gotti did not get that approval. He acted on his own. Killing the head of a family without permission from the council was a grave violation, the kind of thing that could start a war or get the person responsible killed in return. For the moment, though, it worked. Within a short time after the murder, John Gotti became the new boss of the Gambino family. He had gambled everything on a public, unapproved hit, and he had won the top seat. But the way he had done it set off anger that would matter later. The leaders of the other families, and especially the boss of the Genovese family, were furious that Gotti had broken the rules and killed a boss without permission. That anger did not vanish. It would lead to a plot against Gotti's own life down the road, a plot that connects to other chapters in this larger story. For a while, Gotti seemed untouchable. He became the most famous gangster in America. He loved the cameras and the attention. The newspapers gave him nicknames. He was photographed in his fine suits, smiling, looking like a man who had beaten the system. The government put him on trial more than once in the late 1980s and failed each time to convict him. That string of failures earned him a nickname suggesting nothing could stick to him, that charges slid off him like water. He became, for a few years, the public face of the mob, the living image of the confident, glamorous gangster that the movies loved. The truth behind that image was darker, and it came out in the end. The same Sammy Gravano who had sat in the car with Gotti and watched the Castellano murder eventually turned against him. Gravano agreed to work with the government and to tell what he knew. In a trial in 1992, Gravano described, under oath, exactly how the killing of Castellano had been planned and carried out, including how he and Gotti had watched it from across the street and how the order had been given. His testimony was the thing that finally brought Gotti down. Gotti was convicted, including for the murder of Castellano, and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2002. There is a deeper meaning in this murder that is worth sitting with, because it marks a turning point in the whole history of the mob. For most of its existence, the American mob had survived by staying out of sight. The old rule was to keep things quiet, to avoid attention, to handle business in the shadows. The killing outside Sparks Steakhouse broke that rule in the most dramatic way possible. It was loud. It was public. It was done in the heart of the city, in front of crowds, and the man who did it then went on to seek out the spotlight rather than hide from it. That choice changed things. The flood of media attention that followed Gotti made it harder for the mob to operate the way it always had. The whole point of the old quiet ways was to avoid exactly the kind of glare that Gotti invited. The more famous he became, the more the government focused on him and on the mob in general. In trying to become a king, Gotti helped speed along the decline of the very world he had clawed his way to the top of. The public, brazen style that made him a star was also a kind of slow poison for the secrecy the mob had always depended on. Compare this to the previous chapter. The Gemini Lounge stood for the cold, hidden, careful side of mob violence, the kind that left no body and made no noise. The Castellano murder stood for the opposite, the loud, showy, public side. Both were the same family. Both happened within a few years of each other. And together they show the strange range of how these men operated, from silent disappearances in a back room to a broad daylight killing in front of the whole world. The movie version of the mob tends to blend these into one smooth, exciting story. The real record holds both extremes at once, the quiet horror and the loud spectacle, with real bodies at the end of each. The Castellano hit also reveals something about the rules of this world that the films often gloss over. There were rules. There was a council that was supposed to approve the biggest decisions. There was an order to things, a chain that was supposed to be respected, and the breaking of those rules had consequences that rippled out for years. Gotti's unapproved killing made enemies of powerful men who never forgot it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One of those enemies, the Genovese boss who was so enraged by Gotti's broken rules, was a figure unlike any other in this entire story. While Gotti chased fame and posed for cameras, this man did the exact opposite. He went to extraordinary lengths to seem like he was nobody at all, like a confused old man who could not possibly be running anything. For decades, he fooled doctors, courts, and much of the public with one of the strangest acts the mob ever produced. Section 5. Genevieve's family. The boss who pretended to be crazy for close to 30 years. The boss of the Genovese family walked the streets of his New York neighborhood in a bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself, acting like a confused old man who did not know where he was. He looked, to anyone passing by, like a person who needed help, someone whose mind had slipped away. The whole thing was an act. It was one of the longest and most successful performances anyone in the mob ever pulled off, and its only purpose was to keep its performer out of prison. His name was Vincent Gigante. People called him the Chin. He rose through the Genovese family over the years, and eventually became its boss. And at the height of his power, he was considered one of the most powerful gangsters in the entire country. Yet for decades, the public image of him was the opposite of powerful. People in his Greenwich Village neighborhood grew used to the sight of him shuffling down the street in his pajamas and robe, unshaven, looking lost, sometimes appearing to talk to no one at all. The newspapers gave him a fitting nickname for it. They called him the Oddfather. The reason behind the act was simple and clever. In order to be put on trial and sent to prison, a person has to be considered mentally fit, able to understand what is happening to them, and able to help in their own defense. If a person truly cannot understand the court proceedings because of a serious mental illness, the law generally will not put them on trial. Gigante built his entire defense around this idea. If he could convince doctors, judges, and the world that his mind was broken, that he was too ill to understand anything, then he could not be tried. And a man who cannot be tried cannot be convicted. So he committed to the performance with a discipline that is genuinely hard to imagine. This was not a quick trick pulled out for a single court date. It was a way of life, carried on for years and years. He had himself checked into mental hospitals many times over the years before the law finally caught up with him. He behaved strangely in public constantly, so that there would always be witnesses, always neighbors and strangers who could honestly say they had seen the poor confused man wandering around. He kept the act going at home, in public, and in front of the doctors sent to examine him. Some accounts describe him doing things like wandering aimlessly and behaving as though he had no grasp of the world around him. The performance was total. There is a detail in how the people around him treated his name that shows just how seriously the act was protected. Within his world, members were careful about even saying his name out loud, because connecting him directly to anything could be dangerous. Instead of saying his name, people would point to their chin or make a small gesture to refer to him, since his nickname was the Chin. That way, his name stayed out of conversations that might be recorded or repeated. The whole organization worked to keep him hidden in plain sight, a powerful boss disguised as a harmless old man. While he shuffled around in his robe looking helpless, Gigante was in fact running things. The Genovese family was one of the strongest and best organized of the 5 families, and he sat at the top of it. The family had its hands in many businesses across the city. The man who could barely seem to find his way down the sidewalk was, behind the act, making decisions that controlled a vast criminal operation. The gap between the two images, the confused old man and the powerful boss, was the entire trick. His act stands in sharp contrast to John Gotti, the Gambino boss from the previous chapter. The two men were powerful bosses at the same time, and they handled their power in completely opposite ways. Gotti wanted the cameras. He posed in his fine suits, smiled for the newspapers, and loved being the most famous gangster in America. Gigante wanted the exact reverse. He wanted to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be seen as nobody worth bothering with. In a strange way, Gigante's approach was the smarter one. The old rule of the mob had always been to stay quiet and avoid attention, and Gigante took that rule to an extreme that no one had ever tried before. Where Gotti's hunger for fame helped bring him down, Gigante's hunger to seem like nothing kept him free for an astonishingly long time. It worked for a remarkably long stretch. For years, every time the law tried to bring him to trial, the question of his mental state got in the way. His lawyers and his relatives insisted he was seriously ill, suffering from conditions that left his mind unable to function. Court proceedings stalled. Doctors examined him and debated. The act bought him year after year of freedom, while the cases against him sat frozen. But it could not last forever. The people working to bring him down came to believe, strongly, that the whole thing was a performance. Other gangsters who had turned against the mob and become witnesses said plainly that Gigante was faking, that the bathrobe and the mumbling were a deliberate trick to dodge the law. Eventually, a judge ruled that Gigante was mentally fit enough to stand trial. The frozen cases could finally move. In 1997, he was tried and convicted. He was found guilty of serious crimes connected to running the Genovese family, including taking part in plots to get rid of other gangsters. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The long performance had finally failed. The man who had spent decades convincing the world he was a helpless, confused soul was found, by a jury, to be exactly what investigators had always said he was: a sharp and powerful crime boss who had been faking the whole time. Even then, he tried to keep the act going during the trial itself, appearing frail and out of it. But the verdict made clear that the jury did not believe it, and there is a final piece that removed any lingering doubt about whether it had all been a trick. Years later, in 2003, while facing more legal trouble, Gigante finally admitted the truth himself. In a court hearing, he calmly acknowledged that his supposed insanity had been a long pretense, an effort to avoid prosecution. The man who had mumbled and shuffled for decades stood and confessed, in plain and clear terms, that the entire thing had been an act. He died in prison in 2005. There is something worth thinking about in this story, because it shows a different kind of mob power than the violence in the other chapters. The Gemini Lounge showed power through cold, hidden murder. The Castellano hit showed power through loud, public killing. Gigante showed a third kind of power entirely, the power of patience, discipline, and deception. He did not beat the law with guns. He beat it, for decades, with a costume and a performance. He had the self-control to play a confused old man, day after day, year after year, even in his own home, and in front of trained doctors, never breaking character. That level of cold patience is its own kind of frightening. It takes a particular sort of mind to commit to a lie that completely, for that long, and to keep a vast criminal operation running the whole time from behind the disguise. The movies tend to love the loud gangster, the Gotti type, the man who shouts and shoots and grabs the spotlight. Gigante is the proof that some of the most powerful figures in this world were the ones who made themselves seem like nothing at all. The quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who understood that being underestimated was its own kind of armor. There is no thrilling movie scene in a man shuffling down a sidewalk in a bathrobe. But that shuffle kept one of the most powerful criminals in America out of prison for a very long time, and that makes it one of the most remarkable tricks in the entire history of the mob. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, this story has visited the Lucchese family, with its bloody robbery and its corrupt detectives, and the Gambino family, with its killing room and its public murder, and now the Genovese family, with its boss who pretended to be mad. 3 families down, and the Genovese family has more to it than one clever act. Long before Gigante shuffled through Greenwich Village, the Genovese family was born out of a violent grab for power, one that involved a man being shot outside his apartment building and another man being gunned down while sitting helplessly in a barber chair, with a hot towel over his face, unable to see what was coming. Section 6. Genovese Family. The Year of the Barber Chair. The Genovese family did not always carry that name. It got its name from a man who clawed his way to the top through one of the most ruthless power grabs in mob history. A grab that played out across the year 1957 and left 2 famous victims behind. The man was Vito Genovese, and the year he took control is one of the bloodiest turning points in the entire story of the New York mob. To understand what happened, It helps to know the shape of things before the violence began. There was a family, and at the top of it sat a boss named Frank Costello. Costello was a calm, clever leader, more of a smooth operator than a brute. Below and around this world was Vito Genovese, an ambitious and dangerous man who badly wanted to be the boss himself. Genovese had been pushed out of power years earlier and had spent time away from the country, and when he returned, he wanted the top seat back. Costello stood in his way. Standing alongside Costello was another powerful figure, a man named Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was one of the most feared men in the entire underworld. He had a long and terrible history of violence behind him, and he was the boss of his own family, the family that would later be called the Gambino family. Anastasia was an ally of Costello, so for Genovese to take power, he had a problem. He needed to remove Costello, and he needed to deal with Costello's powerful friend Anastasia, because as long as Anastasia stood with Costello, moving against Costello was dangerous. Genovese began to plot. He worked quietly to win the support of other important figures in the underworld, gathering allies for what he planned to do. One of the most important men he won over was Anastasia's own second-in-command, a man named Carlo Gambino. Genovese offered Gambino a tempting deal. If Gambino would help remove his own boss, Anastasia, then Gambino could take over Anastasia's family and become boss himself. Gambino agreed to betray the man he served. This is the cold heart of the mob world, where a trusted second-in-command could be turned against his own boss with the right offer. The first move came against Frank Costello. On May 2, 1957, a gunman approached Costello outside his apartment building and shot him. The shot, however, did not get rid of him. It struck him in a way that left the wound surprisingly minor. Costello survived, but the message was unmistakable. Someone powerful wanted him dead, and the next attempt might not miss. The shooting was enough to convince Costello to step aside. He gave up his position and retired rather than risk being killed. With Costello out of the way, Genovese had cleared his first obstacle and moved closer to the top. The gunman in that shooting, by the way, was a young man who would become very important later. It was Vincent Gigante, the same man from the previous chapter who would decades later pretend to be insane to avoid prison. In 1957, he was a young up-and-comer, doing the dangerous work, and the shooting of Costello helped raise his standing in the mob. The man who would one day shuffle around in a bathrobe got his start, in part, by shooting a boss outside his home. Costello's retirement left one big piece on the board: Albert Anastasia. With Gambino secretly turned against his own boss, the plan against Anastasia could move forward. And what happened to Anastasia became one of the most famous and chilling images in all of mob history. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia went to get a haircut and a shave at a barber shop inside a hotel in Manhattan. He settled into the barber chair. At some point, his face was covered with a hot towel, the way a barber prepares a man for a shave. With the towel over his face, Anastasia could not see. He was relaxed, unguarded, sitting still in the chair, blind to the room around him. His bodyguard had stepped away and was not there to protect him. Then two men with their faces covered walked into the shop and opened fire. Anastasia was shot multiple times as he sat in the chair. The image of it, one of the most feared killers in the country, gunned down while helpless under a barber's towel, became legendary. There is a detail that adds to the horror. In the chaos of being shot, Anastasia is said to have lunged forward and struggled, becoming confused and even attacking the reflections of his killers in the mirror rather than the men themselves. He fell to the floor and died there in the barber shop. One of the most powerful and frightening men in the entire mob world was dead, killed in an ordinary chair during an ordinary errand. After the killing, the pieces fell into place exactly as Genovese had planned. Carlo Gambino, who had betrayed Anastasia, took over Anastasia's family, which from then on would carry Gambino's name. And Vito Genovese took control of the family at the center of all this plotting, the family that would forever after be known by his name, the Genovese family. The whole bloody year of 1957 had reshaped the map of the New York mob. 2 of the 5 families got the names they still carry, born directly out of this violent grab for power. Here it is important to be honest and careful about what can be proven and what cannot, because this is an old case and some of it lives in the area of strong belief rather than courtroom proof. The order behind Anastasia's murder is understood to have come from Genovese, working together with Gambino. That much is the widely accepted account, but the actual gunmen who walked into that barbershop were never identified for certain and were never charged. No one was ever convicted for the killing. Over the years, there have been various claims about who pulled the triggers, but those claims are not settled fact. So the truthful way to hold this is to say that Genovese and Gambino are understood to have arranged the killing, while being clear that the identities of the actual shooters were never proven. Stating it that way keeps the story solid and honest. There is a deeper meaning in this year of violence that is worth sitting with. The whole thing was a kind of cold business takeover, carried out with guns instead of paperwork. Genovese wanted what Costello and Anastasia had, so he arranged to have one shot and frightened into quitting, and the other killed outright. He turned a man against his own boss, with the promise of a promotion. He reshaped the leadership of multiple families to suit his own ambition. There was no anger in it, no personal feud driving it, only the calm, ruthless pursuit of power. Men were removed because they stood in the way, the same way an obstacle is cleared from a path. The barber chair image, in particular, captures something about this world that the movies often soften. A man getting a shave is about as ordinary and harmless a moment as exists. There is nothing more everyday than sitting in a chair, leaning back, letting a barber work. And it was in exactly that moment of total ease and total trust that Anastasia was killed. The lesson buried in it is grim. In that world, no moment was ever truly safe. The most ordinary act, a haircut, a meal, a drive home, could be turned into the setting for a killing. The men in this life could never fully relax, because the people who came for them often came in the quietest, most unguarded moments. This story also shows that the violence in the mob was not only about street-level enforcers and disposable foot soldiers. It reached all the way to the very top. Bosses killed other bosses. Powerful men were shot outside their homes and in barber chairs. The crown was never safe. The man wearing it was often the biggest target of all, because so many others wanted what he had. Vito Genovese proved that a determined, patient, ruthless man could remake the entire underworld through a careful campaign of betrayal and murder. And the families that came out of that year carried the marks of it in their very names for the rest of their existence. So the Genovese family was born in blood, out of a year that saw one boss shot into retirement and another shot dead in a barber chair, with a trusted second-in-command betraying his own leader to claim a throne. Decades later, that same family would be led by a man pretending to be mad. From a brutal, calculated power grab to a long, patient performance of insanity, the Genovese family ran the full range of how these men chased and held on to power. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 families have been covered so far. There are 2 left, and the next one brings the story back around to the world of the movies in the most direct way yet. There was a man who walked into the mob and lived among them for years, eating with them, working with them, earning their trust, becoming almost like family to the very men he was secretly working to destroy. He was not a gangster at all. He was an agent of the law, living a double life so deep and so dangerous that one wrong word could have ended him, and the men who let him in paid a terrible price for their mistake. Section 7. Bonanno Family, the agent who lived as a gangster for 6 years. There was a man who walked into the mob and lived among them for 6 years. He ate at their tables, he did jobs with them, He earned their trust so completely that they wanted to make him one of their own, a full member of the family. The men around him believed he was a small-time jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. He was actually an agent of the law named Joseph Pistone, and the whole time he smiled and laughed and worked beside these men, he was secretly gathering the evidence that would help destroy them. His story is one of the most remarkable in the entire history of the American mob, and it later became a famous movie of its own. Joseph Pistone worked for the law. In the mid-1970s, he took on a secret job that was supposed to last only about 6 months. He would pretend to be a criminal, work his way into the edges of the mob, and gather information. To do this, he became a new person. He took the false name Donnie Brasco and built a fake life around it, the life of a jewel thief, a man who stole and sold jewelry. He learned the things he needed to know to seem real, and then he stepped into that world and left his true self behind. The job that was supposed to take 6 months ended up lasting around 6 years. Pistone went so deep and was so good at the part he was playing that the law kept the operation going far past its original plan. For close to 6 years, he lived a double life of staggering danger. To everyone in the mob, he was Donnie Brasco, a trusted associate. To the law, he was an agent risking his life every single day. One slip, one wrong word, one person who recognized him, and he would have been killed. He started out connected to one of the 5 families, and then moved over toward the Bonanno family, where the heart of his story takes place. The Bonanno family was one of the 5 families of New York. Inside it, Pistone built a close relationship with a gangster named Benjamin Ruggiero, a man people called Lefty. Lefty took Pistone under his wing. He taught him the ways of the mob, vouched for him, and treated him almost like a student or a younger brother. This is a crucial point to understand. In that world, when one member vouches for another man, he puts himself on the line. If the man he vouched for turns out to be a problem, the man who vouched faces the consequences. By bringing Donnie Brasco close and standing behind him, Lefty was tying his own fate to a man who was secretly an agent of the law. Through Lefty, Pistone got close to a higher-ranking member of the Bonanno family, a captain named Dominic Napolitano, a man people called Sonny Black. Sonny Black was a respected and powerful figure, a made member with a serious reputation. He came to trust Donnie Brasco a great deal. The two spent a lot of time together. Sonny Black grew so confident in Donnie that he began to see him as a real prospect, a man worthy of becoming a full member of the family. This is how far Pistone had gotten. He had climbed from the outer edges all the way up to the point where the family wanted to formally bring him in. During those years, Pistone was surrounded by real crime and real danger constantly. He took part in the everyday business of the mob, helping move stolen goods and being present for the kinds of dealings that filled these men's lives. He learned about killings. He heard the secrets. He memorized names and details, because writing things down would have been a death sentence if anyone found notes on him. He had to hold an enormous amount in his head and keep his cover perfect at all times. He spent long stretches away from his own real family, living as someone else, carrying the constant weight of knowing that discovery meant death. There is a moment that captures just how deep he was, and how close the danger came. As the years went on, the family began to push Pistone toward doing something he could not actually do. They wanted him to take part in a killing. In the mob, taking part in a murder was, in a grim way, a sign of being fully committed, a step toward becoming a real member. Sonny Black gave Pistone an order to get rid of a particular man. This put Pistone in an impossible spot. He could not commit a murder. That was never something the law would allow. But refusing an order outright, or failing to carry it out, could expose him or get him killed. This is the point where the law decided the operation had to end. The danger had become too great. There was no way for Pistone to keep going without either committing a murder or blowing his cover in a way that would get him killed. So in the summer of 1981, after close to 6 years, the law pulled Joseph Pistone out. The man known as Donnie Brasco vanished, and the agent went home to his real life. The amount of damage Pistone's work did to the mob is hard to overstate. The information he gathered over those years led to a huge number of legal cases. By the accounts of his work, the evidence he collected led to more than 200 legal charges against mob figures and more than 100 convictions. He had, single-handedly, struck one of the heaviest blows the law had ever landed on the New York mob. A single man, living a lie for 6 years, had done more damage from the inside than almost anything the law had managed from the outside. But the most painful part of this story is what happened to the men who had trusted him. And this is where the human cost comes in. When the law revealed that Donnie Brasco had been an agent all along, it was a catastrophe for the Bonanno family. They had let a man of the law live among them for 6 years. They had shared their secrets with him. They had nearly made him a full member. The embarrassment and the danger of it were enormous. And in that world, such a massive failure could not go unanswered. Someone had to pay for letting it happen. The man who paid was Sonny Black, the captain who had trusted Donnie Brasco and brought him so close. Sonny Black had vouched for the operation in his own way, by embracing Donnie, by sponsoring him, by wanting to make him a member. By the rules of the mob, that failure was his responsibility, and the price for it was death. What makes Sonny Black's end so striking is the way he met it. He understood what was coming. When he was called to a meeting, he seemed to know he would not be coming back. Before he left, he took quiet steps that showed a man putting his affairs in order. He gave away some of his belongings. He left instructions for the care of the pigeons he kept, a small and human detail that says a great deal about a man walking knowingly toward his own death. He did not run, he did not beg. He went to the meeting because, in the code these men lived by, that was what was expected of him, even when the meeting was his own execution. Sonny Black was killed in 1981, and there is a detail about his death that is hard to forget, a detail that carried a specific, terrible meaning within the mob. After he was killed, his hands were cut off. This was not random cruelty. In that world, it was a message. A made member had shaken hands with a man of the law, had welcomed him, had treated him as a brother. The removal of the hands was a symbol of that betrayal of the family's security, a sign of what happens when a member lets the wrong person in close enough to clasp hands. The body, found later, carried that grim message on it. There is something deeply sad woven through this story, and it is worth sitting with. Pistone and the men he deceived were not strangers to each other. Over 6 years, real bonds had formed, at least on the surface. The men genuinely liked Donnie Brasco. They trusted him. Lefty, the man who had taught him and vouched for him, had a real affection for him. There are accounts that even after the truth came out, some of the men struggled to believe it, and that Lefty expressed something close to heartbreak over it, a sense that he had truly cared for the man who turned out to be his undoing. That is the strange and painful texture of this story. The deception was complete, and it worked, and it saved the agent's life, and struck a great blow against the mob. But it ran straight through real human relationships, and it ended with men dead, and others betrayed by someone they had loved like family. It is fair and honest to be clear about what is settled fact here. Joseph Pistone really did live undercover for years inside the mob. The evidence he gathered really did lead to a great many charges and convictions. Sonny Black really was killed for allowing the infiltration, and the detail of his hands being removed is part of the documented account. The order behind Sonny Black's killing was later tied, in court, to the leadership of the Bonanno family, in a case that came many years afterward. So the bones of this story are solid and proven, not legend. The man who would later be convicted of ordering Sonny Black's death was the boss who rose to lead the Bonanno family, and his conviction came through the testimony of insiders who finally turned against the mob. This story connects directly back to where this whole journey started, the world of the movies. Just as the Lufthansa robbery became the heart of one famous mob film, the story of Joseph Pistone became the heart of another. The tale of the agent who lived as Donnie Brasco was turned into a well-known movie about a man caught between two worlds, trusted by gangsters who did not know what he truly was. So once again, the famous screen version rests on a real and documented event. And once again, the real version carries weights the screen can only partly hold. The years of fear, the real friendships twisted into tools, the man putting his pigeons in order before walking to his death. There is a larger meaning in Pistone's story that goes beyond any single killing. His success showed something that shook the mob to its core. For generations, the mob had protected itself with a code of secrecy and a careful suspicion of outsiders. The whole system depended on the idea that they could tell who belonged and who did not, that an outsider could never truly get inside. Pistone shattered that belief. He proved that a determined, careful, brave man could walk straight into their world, win their trust, and live among them for years without being caught. After Donnie Brasco, the mob could never again feel fully safe in its own rooms. The next man at the table, the trusted new associate, the friend who had been vouched for, might be exactly what Pistone had been. That fear, once planted, never fully left. The damage to the Bonanno family from this single operation was severe, and it carried consequences beyond the legal cases and the killing of Sonny Black. The embarrassment of having let an agent of the law live among them for 6 years made the Bonanno family a kind of cautionary tale within the larger mob world. Letting that happen marked them, in the eyes of the other families, as a group that had suffered a humiliating and dangerous failure. A family's reputation mattered in that world, and the Bonanno name took a real blow. It is worth pausing on the sheer length of what Pistone did, because the passage of time is part of what makes it so extraordinary. 6 years is not a brief assignment. It is a span long enough to build a life, to form deep habits, to become genuinely close to people. For all that time, Pistone had to be 2 people at once, perfectly, with no breaks where he could fully be himself among these men. He had to maintain the lie through countless meals, countless conversations, countless small moments where a single careless remark could have unraveled everything. He had to keep his nerve while surrounded by men who killed people, men who would have killed him without hesitation if they had known the truth. The discipline and courage that takes is its own kind of remarkable, the mirror image of the cold discipline shown by gangsters in the other chapters. Where Vito Genovese showed patience in plotting murder, and Vincent Gigante showed patience in faking madness, Pistone showed patience in service of the law, holding a perfect lie for years to bring these men down. And the men he brought down were not minor figures. Through his work, the law gained a clear window into the inner workings of the Bonanno family, including knowledge of a violent struggle for power that was tearing through the family during those very years. While Pistone lived among them, the Bonanno family was in turmoil, with different factions fighting over who would lead. Pistone's position gave the law a front-row view of that bloodshed and the men behind it. His information touched not only the people directly around him, but the larger war shaking the whole family. So, the story of the Bonanno family, like the others, holds both the thrilling surface that the movies love and the darker truth beneath it. On the surface, it is the gripping tale of a brave agent living a double life, the stuff of a great film. Beneath that, it is a story of real human trust, turned into a weapon, of a man cutting another man's hands off as a message, of a captain putting his pigeons in order before walking calmly to his own murder. The movie can give the thrill, the real record gives the full weight, the fear and the friendship and the blood all tangled together. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more thread from the Bonanno family that needs to be pulled, and it leads into the violent power struggle that Pistone had glimpsed from the inside. While Pistone was living among them, the family was at war with itself, and that war produced one of the coldest acts of betrayal in this entire story. Three powerful men were invited to a meeting, told it was a chance to make peace, to talk things out and settle their differences. They walked in believing they were safe. The meeting was a trap, and it had been a trap from the moment it was arranged. Section 8. Bonanno Family, the peace meeting that was a trap. Three powerful men were invited to a meeting and told it was a chance to make peace. They were captains in the Bonanno family, important men with their own crews and their own power. They were told that the meeting was a way to settle the troubles inside the family, to talk things out, and end the fighting. They walked in believing they were there to make peace. The meeting had been a trap from the moment it was arranged, and all three of them were murdered. To understand how it came to this, it helps to understand the trouble inside the Bonanno family in those years. The family was at war with itself. This is something that happened again and again across all 5 families. When the men at the top could not agree on who should lead, the family would split into sides, and the sides would start killing each other. The Bonanno family in this period was deeply divided. On one side were men loyal to the established leadership. On the other side were 3 captains who had grown unhappy and were seen as a threat, men who appeared to be planning to take over the family by force. The 3 captains were named Alphonse Indelicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominic Trinchera. Indelicato was known by the nickname Sunny Red, and Trinchera was a very large man, known as Big Trin. Together, these 3 led a faction that the leadership came to see as dangerous. Word had reached the men on the other side that these 3 captains were gathering weapons and preparing to strike, planning to eliminate their rivals and seize control of the family. Whether every detail of that belief was exact or not, the leadership became convinced that the 3 captains were a deadly threat that had to be removed. There is a man at the center of this who needs to be named, because his role is what makes this case so unusually well proven. His name was Joseph Massino. Massino was a powerful figure on the side of the established leadership, and he became one of the main planners of what happened to the 3 captains. Massino would go on to rise all the way to become the boss of the entire Bonanno family. And many years later, Massino would do something almost no boss of his rank had ever done. He would turn against the mob and become a witness for the law, describing under oath the crimes he had taken part in. Because of that, the inside details of this killing are known not from rumor, but from the words of one of the men who planned it. This is about as solid as evidence gets in the mob world, a top planner himself describing exactly how it was done. The leadership decided that the cleanest way to deal with the 3 captains was to lure them to a meeting and eliminate them all at once. The trap was built around an idea the 3 men would find believable and even welcome. They would be told it was a peace meeting, a sit-down to work out the differences tearing the family apart. In that world, peace meetings were a real thing. Rivals did sometimes gather to settle disputes and avoid further bloodshed. So an invitation to talk peace was not, on its face, alarming. It was the kind of thing a captain might attend in good faith. There was a powerful rule that made the trap even more effective. When men attended a peace meeting, they were expected to come unarmed. Bringing weapons to a sit-down meant for making peace would itself be an insult and a sign of bad faith. So the 3 captains, attending what they believed was a genuine peace meeting, came without weapons. They walked into the room defenseless, exactly as the men who set the trap had counted on. The meeting was held at a social club in Brooklyn. The 3 captains arrived believing they were safe, believing the rules of a peace meeting would protect them. Hidden away, ready and armed, were the men who had been placed there to eliminate them. A signal had been arranged, so the gunmen would know the exact moment to strike. When the 3 captains were in position and the signal was given, the gunmen came out from their hiding place and opened fire. The 3 captains were caught completely off guard, unarmed, with no way to fight back, and no real chance to escape. All 3 were killed in the ambush. The peace meeting had been an execution all along. After the killings, the bodies had to be dealt with, and this connects to the larger world of the New York mob in a striking way. The men who carried out the killing needed help disposing of the bodies. and that help came from outside their own family. There was an arrangement to bring the bodies to a particular spot, a kind of dumping ground, and members of another family assisted with the grim work of getting rid of them. This shows how the families, even as each one had its own internal wars, sometimes cooperated with one another in the practical business of murder and concealment. The bodies were buried, but the burial was not as careful as it should have been, and this is where one of the most haunting details of the whole story comes in. The body of one of the three captains, Sonny Red Indelicato, was not buried deeply or well enough. Sometime after the killing, the body was discovered, and the way it was found is hard to forget. Children came upon it. An arm was sticking up out of the ground, poking through the soil. A man who had walked into a peace meeting alive ended up in a shallow grave, his arm reaching up out of the dirt where children found it. That image, the arm rising from the earth, is the kind of detail that no movie usually dwells on. The plain and ugly aftermath of a killing once the planning and the gunfire are over. For years, the full truth of what happened at that meeting stayed within the mob, known to the men who had been there, but not provable in a courtroom. What changed everything was the decision by Joseph Massino, the top planner who had become boss, to cooperate with the law. After he was convicted of serious crimes, Massino made the rare choice to tell what he knew. He described the killing of the three captains. Because of his testimony, and the testimony of other insiders who turned, the inside story of that day became part of the official record. Massino pleaded guilty to a list of murders, including the killings of the three captains, and he received a sentence of life in prison. The fact that a boss of an entire family chose to become a witness was, by itself, a kind of earthquake in the mob world. For generations, the code held that a member never cooperated with the law, never told its secrets, no matter what. A boss was supposed to be the strongest holder of that code. When Massino broke it, he showed that even the very top of the mob was no longer secure in its silence. The same loyalty that had once seemed unbreakable could give way under enough pressure, and when it did, the secrets came pouring out, including the inside truth of killings like this one. There is a deeper meaning in this story that is worth sitting with, because it reveals something cold at the very heart of how this world worked. The trap relied on the victims trusting the rules. The three captains came unarmed because the rules of a peace meeting said they should. They walked in believing the situation would be honored, because that was the code, and the men who killed them used that trust, that belief in the rules, as the very thing that made the killing possible. In that world, even the rules meant to prevent bloodshed could be turned into tools for it. The promise of peace was the bait. The expectation of safety was the weapon. A man who trusted the code was a man who could be killed by it. This connects to a theme that has run through this entire story. Again and again, the worst violence in the mob came not from open enemies but from trusted insiders, from the betrayal of people who believed they were safe. The Lufthansa robbers were killed by their own boss. Roy DeMeo was killed by his own family. Anastasia was betrayed by his own second-in-command. Sonny Black was killed by his own family for a mistake. And here, three captains were killed by their own family at a meeting meant to bring peace. The danger in that world was rarely the stranger across the street. It was the man across the table, the one smiling and offering to make peace. It is worth being clear and honest about the strength of the evidence here, because this case is one of the most solidly proven in the entire story. The killing of the three captains is not a matter of rumor or legend. It rests on the sworn testimony of Joseph Massino, one of the very men who planned and carried it out, who later described it in detail as a cooperating witness. It rests on the guilty pleas and convictions that followed. It rests on the physical discovery of a body. When a top planner of a murder later confesses to it under oath, and the body is found, and convictions follow, the case stands on about as firm a foundation as any in this dark history. This is the kind of case where the claim of full factual validity is genuinely earned. The killing of the three captains also appears, in a dramatized form, in the movie about the agent Joseph Pistone from the previous chapter. The film touches on this very ambush, weaving it into the story of the man living undercover during the Bonanno family's war with itself. So once again, the famous screen version rests on a real and documented event, and once again, the real version holds weights the screen tends to soften, the unarmed men trusting the rules, the arm reaching up out of the shallow grave, the boss who decades later sat down and confessed to the whole thing. There is something about the calmness of this killing that sets it apart and makes it linger. It was not a sudden burst of violence in the heat of an argument. It was planned carefully, in advance, built around a lie that the victims would find believable. The men who set the trap knew, while they arranged the friendly invitation, that they intended to murder the guests. They knew the three captains would come unarmed, trusting the rules. They arranged a signal so the gunmen would strike at the right moment. Every part of it was thought through. That cold, patient planning, the willingness to smile and offer peace while preparing an ambush, is a particular kind of darkness. It is the same cold patience seen in other chapters, applied here to the betrayal of three men who thought they were walking into safety. The Bonanno family, then, gives this story two of its most powerful chapters. The agent who lived as Donnie Brasco showed how an outsider could slip inside and bring the family down through patient deception. The peace meeting that was a trap showed how the family destroyed itself from within, turning even the promise of peace into a weapon. Both stories share that theme of trust turned into a tool, of the deepest danger coming from the closest place. And both are anchored by the testimony of insiders who finally broke the code of silence. The agent who was never one of them, and the boss who chose to stop being one of them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 families have now been covered. The Lucchese family, with its bloody robbery and its corrupt detectives. The Gambino family, with its killing room and its public murder. The Genovese family, with its boss who faked madness and its violent birth in a barber chair. And now, the Bonanno family, with its undercover agent and its deadly peace meeting. One family remains, and it is the one that fought itself more bitterly and more often than any of the others. This last family tore itself apart, not once but several times over the years, in wars so fierce and so public that they spilled out of the shadows and into the streets, where ordinary people, who had nothing to do with any of it, ended up caught in the crossfire. One of those moments came in broad daylight, in front of a huge crowd, when a boss was shot in the middle of his own public rally. Section 9. Colombo family, shot in front of his own crowd. The boss of the Colombo family was shot 3 times in the head, in front of a huge crowd, in broad daylight, at a public rally he himself had organized. Thousands of people were there. Cameras were there. And in the middle of all of it, while the boss stood near the stage of his own event, a gunman stepped close and opened fire. This happened on June 28, 1971, in a public square in Manhattan, and it was one of the most shocking and public attacks in the entire history of the New York mob. The Colombo family stands apart from the other 4 families in one important way. It fought itself more bitterly and more often than any of the others. Over the years, this single family tore itself apart not once, but several times in violent internal wars. The other families had their power struggles, their betrayals, their killings. But the Colombo family seemed almost cursed by infighting, splitting into warring sides again and again. The story of this shooting is rooted in that history of a family at war with itself. To understand the shooting, it helps to know the man who was shot and how unusual he was. His name was Joe Colombo. He had risen to become the boss of the family, which by then carried his own name. What made Joe Colombo so unusual was that he did something no mob boss was supposed to do. He sought out public attention, the old rule of the mob, the rule that men like the bathrobe-wearing Genovese boss followed so carefully, was to stay quiet and out of sight. Joe Colombo did the opposite. He stepped into the public eye on purpose. He did this through a public organization he created. Colombo set up a group whose stated purpose was to fight against what he claimed was unfair treatment of Italian Americans. He argued that the law was unfairly targeting Italian Americans and that they were being portrayed badly. Whatever the real motives behind it, the group grew quickly and gained real attention. It drew large numbers of members and held big public rallies. Colombo became a public figure, appearing in the kind of spotlight that mob bosses traditionally avoided at all costs. He held large gatherings in a public square in Manhattan, drawing enormous crowds. This public approach made him a strange and, to some, a troubling figure within the mob world. The other powerful men of the underworld generally believed in staying hidden. A mob boss standing on a stage in front of thousands of people, drawing cameras and crowds and attention to himself, went against everything the mob valued about secrecy. To some of the powerful men watching, Colombo had become a problem. His appetite for the spotlight was the opposite of how a boss was supposed to behave. Running alongside this was a more personal and violent thread, and it reaches back into the family's history of fighting itself. There was a man named Joey Gallo. Gallo and his brothers had been part of a long and bitter feud within the family that stretched back years. A feud full of kidnappings and killings. Gallo had spent a long stretch of years in prison. In early 1971, he was released. Once out, he wanted back in, wanted to reclaim his place and his territory. There was an attempt to make peace between Colombo and Gallo. Colombo offered Gallo a sum of money as a peace gesture, $1,000. Gallo found the offer deeply insulting given the long and bloody history between them. He refused it and reportedly demanded a far larger sum, $100,000, to settle the conflict. Colombo refused to pay that. The bad blood between them remained, unresolved and dangerous. Then came the day of the shooting. On June 28, 1971, Joe Colombo was at a large public rally in Manhattan, one of the big gatherings put on by his organization. Thousands of people filled the square. Colombo was there, in the open, surrounded by his supporters and by the public attention he had courted. A young man got close to him. The young man was named Jerome Johnson. He drew a gun and shot Colombo 3 times, including in the head. In the chaos that followed, the gunman, Jerome Johnson, was himself immediately shot and killed by Colombo's bodyguards right there at the scene. So the shooter died on the spot, which meant he could never be questioned, never explain why he had done it, or who, if anyone, had sent him. That silence is part of why the full truth of the shooting remains uncertain to this day. Joe Colombo did not die at the rally, but the wounds were devastating. The 3 shots, including the one to the head, left him almost completely paralyzed and unable to function. He never recovered. He lived on for years in this broken state, unable to lead. His life as a powerful boss effectively ended in that moment in the square. He finally died in 1978, years after the shooting, from the lingering effects of his wounds. In a real sense, his end came at that rally in 1971, even though his body held on for several more years. Here it is important to be careful and honest about what can be proven and what cannot, because this is a case where strong belief and proven fact must be kept separate. Many people in the Colombo family blamed Joey Gallo for the shooting, believing he had arranged it as revenge in their long feud. The theory that Gallo was behind it is the most widely repeated explanation. But it is a theory, not a proven fact. The gunman, Johnson, was killed at once and could not be questioned. Investigators eventually concluded that Johnson appeared to have acted on his own, and the connection to Gallo was never proven in any court. So the truthful way to hold this is to say that many believed Gallo was responsible, that it remains the leading theory, but that it was never proven, and the shooter's true motive died with him. Stating it that way keeps the story honest. Anyone who claims to know for certain who sent Johnson is reaching past what the evidence allows. What is not in doubt is what came next in the feud. Less than a year after Colombo was shot, Joey Gallo himself was killed. On April 7, 1972, Gallo was gunned down while out at a restaurant in Little Italy in Manhattan, celebrating an occasion. Men connected to the Colombo family shot him down. So the cycle of the family's internal feud claimed another life. Colombo was shot at his rally, left a broken man, and Gallo was shot dead at a restaurant within a year. The two central figures of that chapter of the feud were both destroyed in quick succession, one paralyzed, the other killed. There is a deeper meaning in the Colombo shooting that is worth sitting with, because it captures something about the limits of the mob world and the dangers of breaking its oldest rule. Joe Colombo broke the rule of staying out of sight. He chased the spotlight, held public rallies, became a famous face. And the spotlight that he loved became, in the end, the setting for his destruction. He was shot in the most public way imaginable, in front of thousands, at his own event. The very visibility he had cultivated put him in a place where a gunman could walk up to him in a crowd. There is a hard lesson buried in it about that world. The men who survived longest were usually the ones who stayed hidden, like the bathrobe-wearing boss who pretended to be nobody. The man who stepped into the light made himself a target in the most literal way. This connects to a comparison that runs through this whole story, the contrast between the bosses who sought attention and the ones who avoided it. John Gotti of the Gambino family loved the cameras and was eventually brought down, in part, by the glare he invited. Joe Colombo loved the cameras and was shot at his own public rally. Vincent Gigante of the Genovese family hid behind an act of madness and stayed free for decades. The pattern is striking. In that world, attention was danger. The men who wanted to be seen tended to come to bad ends, while the men who wanted to disappear tended to last. Joe Colombo's shooting is one of the clearest examples of what the spotlight could cost. The shooting also shows, once again, how the violence of the mob spilled out of the shadows and into the public world where ordinary people lived. This was not a quiet killing in a back room or a body buried in a remote spot. It happened in a crowded public square, in daylight, in front of thousands of regular people who had come to attend a rally. The gunfire erupted in the middle of a public crowd. The mob's violence, which so often happened in hidden places, here burst into the open in front of the whole city. That willingness to bring the bloodshed into public spaces where anyone might be nearby is part of what made the Colombo family's wars so notorious. It is worth pausing on how this fits the larger pattern of the Colombo family tearing itself apart. The shooting of Joe Colombo and the killing of Joey Gallo that followed were part of a long history of the family fighting itself. The feud between the Gallo side and the family's leadership stretched back years before the shooting and produced a string of killings over time. This was a family that could not stop turning its violence inward. The shooting at the rally was one dramatic chapter in a much longer story of internal war, a story that would erupt again in later years in an even bloodier way. The fact that the shooter died at the scene is one of the things that makes this case so frustrating from the standpoint of pure proof, and it is worth being clear about that. Because Jerome Johnson was killed immediately, the most important witness to his own motive was gone. He could not say who, if anyone, had put him up to it. He could not confirm or deny the theory that Gallo was behind it. The dead cannot testify, so the shooting of Joe Colombo sits in a strange place in this story. The event itself is fully documented and certain. Colombo really was shot 3 times in front of a huge crowd, really was left paralyzed, really did die years later from the wounds. The gunman really was Jerome Johnson, who really was killed at the scene. All of that is solid. What remains uncertain is the why and the who behind it, and honesty requires holding that uncertainty rather than pretending to a certainty the evidence does not support. The movies and popular stories about the mob have touched on the world of the Colombo family and its wars, including the colorful and violent figure of Joey Gallo. But the real shooting of Joe Colombo carries a weight that goes beyond any dramatization. It is the image of a powerful man, at the height of his public fame, brought down in an instant in front of the very crowd he had gathered, and then living on for years as a broken shell of who he had been. That long, slow ending, the years spent paralyzed and unable to lead, is the kind of grim aftermath that the exciting stories tend to skip past in favor of the dramatic moment of the gunfire. So the Colombo family enters this story with the image of a boss shot in front of his own crowd, a family that turned its violence outward into a public square and inward against its own members in the same long feud. The shooting of Joe Colombo and the killing of Joey Gallo were dramatic, but they were not the worst of the Colombo family's wars. They were a chapter in a longer history of a family that could not stop fighting itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The bloodiest chapter was still to come. Years after Colombo was shot, the family would tear itself apart yet again, in a war so fierce and so out of control that it would become known as one of the worst internal wars the New York mob ever saw. This time, the fighting would drag on, faction against faction, with bodies piling up across the city. And in the middle of that war, the violence would reach people who had nothing whatsoever to do with the mob, including young people, even children, who simply happened to be in the wrong place when the shooting started. Section 10. Colombo Family, the war that killed children. The Colombo family went to war with itself one final time, and it was the bloodiest war of all. It dragged on for around 2 years. The family split into 2 armed sides, and those 2 sides hunted each other across the city. Before it was over, 12 people were dead, and among the dead were innocent people who had nothing to do with the mob at all, including young people, even teenagers, who simply happened to be in the wrong place when the shooting started. This war is remembered as one of the worst internal wars the New York mob ever saw, and it is a fitting place to end, because it shows the real cost of this world more plainly than any movie ever has. This happened in the early 1990s, long after the shooting of Joe Colombo. It is sometimes called the Third Colombo War, because the family had torn itself apart in violent fashion before. The pattern of a family that could not stop fighting itself reached its terrible peak here. To understand the war, it helps to understand the split that caused it. The official boss of the family was a man named Carmine Persico. Persico was in prison, serving a very long sentence. A boss could sometimes still run a family from behind bars, passing orders to the outside, and Persico tried to do exactly that. While he was locked up, he had placed another man in charge of the day-to-day running of the family as an acting boss. That man's name was Victor Orena. Orena was meant to be a temporary stand-in, holding the seat until Persico's chosen successor could take over. Over time, Orena came to want the position for himself. He began to feel that Persico, running things from prison, was out of touch and was costing the family money. Orena decided he should be the real boss, not just a temporary placeholder. He tried to get the larger mob world to recognize him as the rightful boss. When that did not work, the conflict turned violent. Persico, learning of Orena's ambitions, saw it as a betrayal and a threat. The conflict came to a head in the most direct way. Persico's side decided to eliminate Orena. In June 1991, a group of gunmen waited near Orena's home, ready to ambush and eliminate him. But the plan went wrong. Orena spotted the men waiting for him and managed to escape before they could strike. That failed ambush was the spark. The attempt on Orena's life set off the war. The family split cleanly into 2 sides, one loyal to the imprisoned Persico and one loyal to Orena, and the 2 sides began trying to eliminate each other. What followed was around 2 years of mayhem. Hit teams from each side hunted members of the other. The killing happened across the city, on public streets, outside homes, near shops and clubs. Men were shot down as they went about their days. The 2 factions traded killing for killing, each death feeding the next. By the time it was over, 12 people had died, and more than 80 members and associates from both sides were eventually convicted, jailed, or charged. The war did not just eliminate people. It gutted the family, leaving it weaker than it had ever been. So weakened that it is often considered the weakest of the 5 families in the years that followed. The hardest part of this war, the part that sets it apart from so much else in this story, is who else died. In most of the killings covered so far, the victims were part of the mob world, gangsters killing other gangsters. This war broke that pattern in the cruelest way. Among the 12 dead were innocent bystanders, people who had no connection to the mob whatsoever, who were killed simply because they were near the violence when it erupted. 2 of those innocent victims were young, and their stories are the heart of why this war matters. One was a 17-year-old who worked in a bagel shop. The shop was believed to be connected to members of one of the 2 sides, and gunmen came looking for their targets there. The young worker, who had nothing to do with any of it, was killed in that attack. He was a teenager working a job at a bagel store, and he died because of a war between grown men over who would lead a crime family. The other young victim was a 16-year-old who was simply nearby when a shooting broke out. During an attack meant for someone connected to the rival side, gunfire sprayed into the area, and this 16-year-old, an innocent bystander, was shot in the head and gravely wounded. He was sitting in the wrong place at the wrong moment, caught in the crossfire of a war he had no part in. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the truest answer to the question this whole story asks. A teenager working at a bagel shop, killed. A 16-year-old sitting nearby, shot in the head. These were children, in the everyday sense of the word. They were not gangsters. They had not chosen this life, had not taken any oath, had not committed any crime. They were just young people in their own neighborhood, and they were destroyed because 2 factions of grown criminals could not settle who would sit at the top of a crime family. That is the real cost of this world. The cost the movies almost never show. It is important to be clear and honest about the strength of the evidence here, because this case is exceptionally well proven. The Third Colombo War was the subject of many legal cases. The facts of it, including the deaths of the innocent young people, are laid out in detailed court records. Victor Orena was convicted and received a sentence of life in prison plus many additional years. Dozens of other men from both sides were convicted. The killings of the innocent bystanders were established through trials, through witnesses, through the official record. This is not legend or rumor. It is documented history, proven in courtrooms, about as solid as any case in this entire story. There is a deeper meaning in this war that brings together every thread of this story, and it is the right note to end on. Think back to where this began. It began with a movie, Goodfellas, that made the mob look thrilling and fun, full of money and laughter and loyalty. A world a young boy could dream of joining. That movie was based on a true story, and the true story was already darker than the screen let on. But the movie made a choice. It chose to show the joy first and the cost only later. The way the man it was based on remembered his own life. It softened things. It had to fit in a couple of hours, and it had to keep an audience entertained. Across these 12 sections, the full picture has come into view, and it is far worse than any movie. The famous robbery that looked like the perfect crime ended with a dozen people murdered to silence them, including a wife who simply rode in a flashy car and a person found frozen in a meat truck. A pair of police detectives, the men sworn to protect people, turned their badges into tools for a killer and helped eliminate an innocent man who shared a name with the wrong person. An ordinary neighborhood bar hid a back room where killing was turned into a cold routine. A boss was gunned down on a busy street during the holidays. Another boss spent 30 years pretending to be insane. A family was born from a man shot in a barber chair while helpless under a hot towel. An agent's 6 years of friendship ended with a man's hands cut off as a message. 3 men were lured to a peace meeting and executed. One of them found by children, with his arms sticking up out of the ground. A boss was shot in front of his own crowd. And finally, a 2-year war over who would lead a crime family killed 12 people, including a teenager at a bagel shop and a 16-year-old caught in the crossfire. The thread that runs through all of it is the same. The mob's worst violence came not from open enemies, but from trusted insiders. The Lufthansa robbers were killed by their own boss. Roy DeMeo was killed by his own family. Albert Anastasia was betrayed by his own second-in-command. Sonny Black was killed by his own family. 3 captains were killed by their own family at a meeting meant for peace. Time after time, the deadliest danger was not the stranger across the street. It was the friend across the table, the boss, the partner, the man who smiled while planning the killing. The loyalty the movie celebrated was, in the real world, a thin and breakable thing that gave way the moment a man became useful to kill. The other thread is the cost to people who never chose this life at all. The innocent Nicholas Guido, shot after Christmas dinner because of a mix-up in a killer's information. The wife in the pink car. The teenager at the bagel shop. The 16-year-old on the bench. These are the people the exciting stories leave out, because they do not fit the dream. There is nothing glamorous about a child shot dead over a leadership dispute. There is no thrilling music for it. It is just plain and ugly and sad, and it is the truest thing about this world. So the question the title asks has its answer. Is the real story of the 5 families worse than the movie? It is. The movie is a true story, and even being true, it had to soften what really happened, because the full truth is harder to sit through than any film. The real record, the one written in courtrooms and dug up out of the ground, holds more bodies, more betrayal, and more innocent victims than any screen could comfortably show. The movie gives the thrill, the truth gives the weight, and the weight is heavier than the movie ever let on. Everything covered here came from real cases, real testimony, real trials, and real reporting. Where something is only a strong belief rather than a proven fact, that has been said plainly, because the truth does not need to be exaggerated to be terrible. The men who told these secrets were insiders, who finally broke the code of silence, including a boss who chose to confess to his own crimes. The bodies that were found were real bodies. The convictions were real convictions. And the children who died in that last war were real children, with real families, who lost them forever, over nothing more than a question of who would run a crime family. That is the story the movie could not fully tell. That is the story underneath the one the whole world thinks it knows. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.